I want to talk today about identification. This sort of continues our conversation from Tuesday. And so just to recap a little bit, let me just sort of remind you where we left off on Tuesday, which is to start with the idea that a news story or any story in journalism ought to include all the relevant information to that piece. And therefore, any decision to withhold information from a story, any information that's known to the reporter and known to editors, but is deliberately not shared with a reader, it violates the idea, or at least compromises one of the fundamental principles that we're about here, which is disclosing what we know, reporting what we know. As I mentioned the other day, though, obviously, there are instances in which those compromises are both inevitable and desirable, really. So we talked about, if you knew about, nuclear weapons secrets or movements of troops, or in some cases in some law enforcement issues where there might be lives at risk or the integrity of investigations, there are certain instances where it makes ethical sense to withhold information. And so I want to talk today about two areas beyond the kind of national security and law enforcement context, although there is some law enforcement issues today, which is to deal with issues involving children, and those involving certain kinds of crimes, either victims of crimes or people who otherwise are part of criminal investigations. So the first question, I guess, is how do you decide when to withhold a piece of information? And this is true for the kinds of examples we talked about on Tuesday and the kinds we'll talk about today. And I guess I would suggest that a threshold question to be asked by anyone in this kind of debate is that the damage that could be caused by disclosure has to decisively outweigh the benefits of openness. Just to repeat that, the analysis here, it's almost a legal analysis, which is to say it's a balancing test. And on one side you have the benefits of openness, and on the other side you have the risk of harm. And I would say that the risk of harm has to not just, sort of a tie goes to openness, so that if you're going to make a decision to withhold, the downside risk has to substantially outweigh the important benefit of openness, which underlies our profession. In those instances where you do decide, or where editors and reporters do decide to withhold a piece of evidence or a piece of information, then there are things that can be done to try to limit the compromise to the principle of openness. Any decision to suppress a piece of information should be made on a rare basis. They shouldn't be common. The piece of information that is withheld ought to be as limited as possible. And this goes back to what we talked about with respect to anonymous sources. It may mean withholding the name, but disclosing, the affiliation of the person whose name is being withheld. It may be possible to reveal other details that help readers to understand an event or the biases of the person or information that are being withheld, while still withholding enough information to prevent the damage that might result from disclosure. And where it's relevant and possible, it should be explainable to readers. So if a piece of information is being withheld, if we're going to talk in a minute here about identities of children or victims of crimes, if that information is being withheld, it should be explained in the story or somewhere in a way that readers can find it, why it's being withheld. This is part of what you read about in the text a while back on transparency. To the degree possible, we should explain what we're doing to readers, particularly if we're withholding. And then finally, before I dive into some examples, let me just emphasize that the limits and the decisions that we're talking about here are almost always ethical decisions, not legal ones. The law very rarely prevents the identification of a person involved in a crime or a person, of people generally who come under the reach of law enforcement. And not only that, if the names, for instance, of witnesses or victims are put in police reports or incident reports or lawsuits, as long as the reporting on those documents is accurate and fair, the news organization that reports them is utterly protected from legal action against them. Because fair reporting on government documents is what journalists do. So the law allows special protection for as long as you're quoting the document correctly, and as long as you say in the story that you are quoting from the document. There are some proceedings that are closed, particularly involving children, and again, we'll talk about some of this in a minute. Let me see if I can spill my water for the third time here. There's sometimes that a proceeding will be closed, so you won't be allowed to attend a juvenile hearing, for instance. But if you obtain information that's part of that proceeding or that's part of documents related to it, you're not prohibited from publishing it. Now, there are times, though, where, as I talked about this briefly the other day, the law generally provides a sort of floor for ethical conduct, and ethical conduct needs to be, in general, higher than the legal standard. So for instance, let's say you got a police report that, let's sort of worst case scenario, imagine there was a mob hit in the area that you're writing about. And you got a police or incident report that detailed the circumstances of the crime and that identified witnesses. Let's assume that the person who committed this crime has not been apprehended. You could write a story that you would be legally protected in writing, that would name the witnesses to the murder. If you did so, you would likely put those people in substantial danger. So while you would be legally protected in doing it, I think you'd have to have an argument within your news organization about whether it was ethically appropriate to do so. So that's just a small example, but I cite it just so that you'll keep in mind that what I'm talking about here today is almost always an ethics conversation, not a legal conversation, that very rarely would you face legal jeopardy for identifying the kinds of people that I'm talking about today. Okay, so let me start then with children. The main issue with reporting on children is that children are generally not thought of as capable of making a really considered decision about identifying themselves, that they may not fully understand how profound the consequences might be for their names and actions appearing in news coverage. And as such, it's incumbent on journalists to be protective of children, even when they're not protective of themselves. And sometimes I think this even extends to when their parents may not be making a wise decision regarding disclosure for them. So to illustrate these points, let me just pose a couple of hypotheticals to you all and ask you what you think of them. Imagine you're a reporter, let's say you're at a student newspaper, although this could be any newspaper. The fact that it's a student newspaper is not particularly relevant. But you were writing a story about cheating at your school. And you do a bunch of interviews, and most of the students you talk to want to be anonymous, and you talk to them about, could I identify you as such and such a major? You're going to do the whole conversation we talked about anonymous sourcing. But you've gotten to this point where you've now got a number of students talking, most of them off the record, about cheating in classes. But then a couple of them say to you, you know what, I don't care, I'm about to graduate, I don't care, go ahead and name me. Now, let me tweak the hypothetical just a tiny bit. Let's assume we're talking about a high school, not about adult students such as yourselves. My question is, do you name those students? Let's say these are 16, 17-year-old students. They've agreed to be named. They tell you, go ahead, use our names. What do you do? Anyone want a shot at that? Yes, please.
I probably wouldn't name them, only because at that age they might not understand if you're older, I don't know, they might not understand the problem of naming yourself as a cheater, especially if they're going on to college and they have some kind of incident, it could come back to them and they might not know it, and I don't really know if using their name benefits your story that much.
I will say this, right, going back to our discussion on anonymous sources though, now if you don't name them, your story is going to rely entirely on anonymous people. It will be not as strong as if they were named. I'm not arguing against you necessarily, but just to emphasize that there is the story and the integrity of the story does pay a price for allowing them to withhold their names. I saw someone else up here, yeah?
Yeah, I agree. I don't think that, the story is just about cheating in general. So even if a reader were to read that it was an anonymous source, I think that it would make sense to the reader as to why they chose to be anonymous. Be an understandable reason. So I think that the story would still be credible, and I don't necessarily think that names would contribute a lot to the story, even if it would make it that much.
And you certainly could do what we talked about earlier. You could say they're not being named for the following reasons. So-and-so is a senior, says he graduated on such and such, or cheated on such and such a test, but asked not to be named for fear that it would harm his college transcript or whatever. Yes?
But there's also the alternative perspective that it might be more interesting of the story if someone who's prominent in the student body, who you wouldn't expect to have that type of stance,
Right.
provide their insight.
Right, the valedictorian of the class says so.
Right.
Probably wouldn't be valedictorian for long, but right.
But there's also, on the other hand, you could also skillfully name someone without actually naming them. So, for instance, the captain of one of the boys' varsity teams, or it's a narrow enough field where there's only maybe 6 or 7 teams, and there's only 6 or 7 captains, perhaps. Maybe co-captains, so maybe 14 people. But it's going to be one of these people, and I think the student body is smart enough to know generally who that person is most likely to be.
Let me ask you this. That actually takes us in a slightly different direction, but I'm curious. Let's say you did that. Let's say you said so-and-so who is a well-known student and captain of one of the sports teams. If there are only 10 captains of sports teams, what happens when the other 9 come to you and say, now you've made it look like I'm a cheater? I mean, one of the problems, and I'm not arguing with you so much as to say, one of the problems with limited identification is that you can falsely implicate the wrong people. Now, if you said that this is a student with a 4.0 grade average or whatever, that might be a way of making the point that this is a serious student, not just a fuck up, but without saying this is one of the following 10 people, which is sort of a dangerous thing to do. Yeah.
No, I think by the time you're 15, 16, you already know right from wrong, and according to ethical guidelines, you should name your sources whenever you can. And if he wants to be named, like as a journalist, like I would even go further and beyond and tell him the repercussions that could happen.
Mm-hmm.
I let him know, hey, if I name you, it could hurt you in college. If he's still like, or she's still like, well, go ahead, I don't care.
Right, maybe I'm not going to college. I don't care, I'm done. I mean, I think that's one of the things you've really put your finger on that I think is important here is having a frank conversation with the source about what they might expect if this happens. And I think that's always a valuable thing to do when dealing with sources who are not sort of in the news business generally. If you're talking to a United States senator, you don't need to say, listen, if you go on the record, it might hurt you in November. But if you're talking to someone who's not used to being covered, it's generally a good idea to try to explain to them in some reasonable way what the ramifications are that they're getting into. Sometimes it may mean at the end of it that they make a decision that you don't agree with, but so be it. Informing them is a good idea. Is there anyone else? All right, let me go to a next example that pushes this a little further. Let's say the story you're writing is about dating. Again, let's start in a high school context here. And, some kids talk about dances or pressures or whatever, but a few then talk candidly about having sex with their partners, or boyfriends, girlfriends. All right, well, that's better than the water anyway. A couple of them say to you they want to talk on the record because they're practicing safe sex and their parents know about it and they think it will help they think they can set a good example for other students if they're named. Do you name them? Who? Yeah.
If they want to be named, I think that if they want to make a conscious decision to be named and they want to help others, then it's fine. It's not like they're saying, oh, they did drugs and it's a helpful benefit.
Right. I'm about to have a drug example in a minute, so you're skipping ahead. Right. There's nothing illegal about this, right? I mean, there are limited circumstances in which it could be illegal if one is over 18 and one is under 18. So there are some instances that would have special implications for these kids. But let's assume for the moment that that's not present in this case. Yeah.
I think in that situation you would need to talk to their partner also because
Sure.
that's definitely putting them
Mhm.
out there when maybe they don't want to be, and that's something that should be private if they don't want to be in the newspaper.
Yeah, you've raised a really good point, and actually I had neglected to include it in these examples, but it's really important that sometimes a person's decision to identify themselves about something implicates another person. This comes up all the time. How many times have you seen some celebrity story about someone saying they were abused as a kid? It's like a stock celebrity story these days. Well, one thing to remember about that is they're accusing someone of a crime when they do that. They're not just confessing to sort of a personal anguish. If you say, I was, mistreated by my dad, well, if my dad's still alive, my dad might have something to say about that. So sometimes what can seem confessional is in fact accusatory, and you really need to be mindful of the other people. In this case, as you say, if you're having sex with someone, and that person might not want that known. So that's another implication of this. Who else? Is there anyone here who, I'm sorry, go ahead.
I think as long as the ramifications of telling their name are told to a kid, and in this case both partners are consenting to put their name out there, then yeah, you can put their name out, but it's up to them. As long as they know what the consequences are of doing this, then I think it's their decision.
I guess the question that is at the bottom of this, and I certainly agree, but is how can you know if they fully appreciate the consequences of what they're saying? If I were talking to a 25-year-old about sex and safe sex or whatever, I would have no question in my mind, or relatively little question anyway, I guess, about whether that person can make a conscious decision, a mindful, thoughtful decision about what it would mean to be in the paper talking about sex. If it were a 17 or 18-year-old, I'm a little more hinky. If it's a 14 or 15-year-old, I'm starting to get really nervous. And that really, one of the questions, I guess, with respect to kids is, what can make you confident that they're making a really thoughtful decision? I mean, yes?
Since these kids are in high school, I'm assuming they're minors.
Yes, let's assume that they're not 18 for a moment. Let's assume that they're 16, 17, right?
Okay, so at what point does a journalist have to like talk to their parents about the gender?
Really good question. And there, again, let me stress that this is an ethics question, not a legal question. For the most part, if the children, are making if they are told what's going on here, they understand they're talking to a reporter, they understand they might be in the newspaper, they can make a decision. The question is, are you willing to accept that decision in the absence of talking to their parents? Now, I guess there's, again, no clear answer to this, but I guess what I would say is, you as the reporter, or you as the editor, you as the journalist in this, understand better than they do what this is going to mean. That you're going to write a story that quotes them saying something that 25 years from now might be embarrassing to them, and that will, for all practical purposes, live on forever. So you need to have you need to look out for their interests in a way that you wouldn't if you were writing about Obama or Mayor Riordan. They can look out for their own interests. And in some cases, the answer to that is to go to their parents, because the parents obviously are the ones who have, a real moral responsibility to look out for their interests throughout their lives. So, I'm not answering your question except to agree with you that the question of talking to parents and involving parents in this is a really important thing to consider. Yeah.
I think that if they're like 16 or 17, like when you turn 18, you don't magically become more conscious of anything.
Mhm.
So I think that some 17-year-olds can be much more mature and can make much more logical and wise decisions when they're 17 than some people who are like 25. So I think you have to be able, after you tell them the ramifications,
Mhm.
I think you should be able, after having a conversation with them, you should have been able to feel out and determine for yourself about how mature they are.
Right. So what do you do, though? Let's say you've talked to this 17-year-old for a while, and you've gotten to know them a bit. I mean, let's face it, you're not really going to know them that well. You're reporting a story. It's not a lifelong friend. But let's say you come to the conclusion, you think this is a responsible person, this is a thoughtful person. Their reasons for wanting to be on the record are really compelling. They want to set a good example. So you go ahead and you write that story and you publish that person's name, and then the parents call you the following morning and say, how dare you publish my kid's name talking about having sex? Let's say the kid said to you, my parents know all about this, but the parents say, I didn't know about it. I'd read for the first time in your newspaper that my kid is having sex. And now that will haunt my child forever. That's a tough conversation. And even if you've done your best to assess this person, one answer might have been to call the parents first and see if the parents know about it. Now, parents, listen, I'm a parent, and parents can make plenty of bad decisions too. So that might not, clear the whole slate, but at least you would avoid that phone conversation the next morning, which would not be a pleasant one. Anyone else on this example? Yeah.
I think if you do approach the parents, you should inform the 16 or 17-year-old that you're going to beforehand. Just because that might kind of make them really sit back and think, well, wait, is this something I really want to do?
That's a really good idea. In fact, it's also a reminder of something else, which is that disclosing information as a journalist, we almost always think about it in terms of what you publish. But the fact is, in reporting a story, you can also disclose information. And you have to be very careful. I mean, the most obvious example would be if someone told you something off the record and said, I want to tell you, whatever, that off the record. And then you went to the next person and said, well, I'm not going to put his name in the paper, but it was Bob who told me this. Well, then in effect, you violated your promise of anonymity, even though you've not published anything. That's sort of what happened to Judy Miller in a certain way. In this case, if you said to the people, now if they say they're on the record, you're not in danger of violating their anonymity in that way, but you're absolutely right that just the prospect of their parents having that conversation with you might cause them to think about it differently. And if so, better to catch it now than once it's in the paper when it's too late to fix it. Yeah.
I was an editor on my school paper.
Oh, yeah?
And we actually did a piece on safe sex.
Really?
And we did publish the names,
Mhm.
but only if they were over 18, just so the parents wouldn't be liable.
Mhm.
If they got in trouble. And also, because in high school, at least at my high school, people kind of already knew who was.
Right.
So it
In a
was-
small community, you're probably not disclosing a lot. Well, the decision to only use 18-year-olds, though, I think is a smart one. Because it clearly, as someone pointed out, there are a lot of 18-year-olds who are less mature than a lot of 16-year-olds. But at least you've kind of crossed what we all recognize as a kind of legal threshold. That the sex that they're having is legal, for one thing, which is helpful. Yes. Both of you, either order, yeah. All right, go ahead.
I was just, what are the actual legalities that surround sort of reporting on minors? I mean, is it just their consent, or do you need parental consent? What is it?
Well, as I say, for the most part, what we're talking about here, and first of all, the legalities of anything in journalism tend to vary state to state, because different states have different rules, as do, by the way, the rules with respect to sex. I mean, different states will have different statutory rape laws and whatnot. So wherever you were reporting, you'd need to know the legal context of what you were saying, because you need to know if you're accusing people of crimes, even if they're sort of rarely enforced criminal statutes. In general, though, while you might be writing on conduct that might be legal or illegal, the writing about it is almost always legal. Now, there are some instances where you could be so reckless with someone's privacy, for instance, that you might subject yourself to a civil suit. But it's very rare that anything you write is going to subject you to a prosecution, for the simple reason, as I've said many times, that the First Amendment is quite absolute in its limits on how the government can prosecute speech. So really what we're talking about here is doing the right thing ethically, not doing the right thing legally, because you're almost always going to be within the law. Yes, I'm sorry, yes.
This kind of goes back to an earlier point about whether or not the child fully understands what's going on. I feel like journalists themselves are intelligent people. You're having a conversation with someone, they're holding up their end. You can tell whether that person knows what's going on or not, kind of, and make your own personal judgment a little bit. And that's where kind of the journalist has to decide.
This is one of the areas, by the way, where when I talk about how much confidence and responsibility editors place in reporters, this is a really prime example of that. Because you're going to come back to the paper and file your story, and the editor reading this piece is not going to have had the benefit of what you've just described, which is to really size up the person you're writing about and get a sense of whether they're capable of making this kind of decision. When in doubt, the parents are a helpful stopgap in that for a variety of reasons. But yeah, you're going to have to make some judgments about the maturity of the kids you're dealing with. Who else? Yes.
I read magazine articles where they use pseudonyms. For example, they use two people's name, but then at the end they mention that that the names are replaced because of for their privacy. I'm not really sure what's the.
The Times guidelines, I didn't bring a copy with me today, but I do believe there's reference in the Times ethics guidelines to pseudonyms. I think that we pretty strictly prohibit them on the theory that it is one thing not to use a person's name, it's another to falsify a name, because that really introduces something, even if it's a device that's admitted in the piece, it does make something, it does report something untrue, which is to say, to pretend that this name is a real name. I don't think the practice can be used sort of wantonly or carefully. In general, it would be my own preference to use a first name or to acknowledge that the name is not being used rather than to use a pseudonym, which I think creates a different problem. Yes?
I think the main reason the pseudonyms are used is like when they want to kind of personalize or, this happened to poor Susie, and then her father did this, so it kind of gets the reader to
Right.
more instead of this girl that will not name and then she.
Right, and that's certainly, it's not the worst example of a sort of storytelling device. I mean, but I would just say there's a lot of things you could do to stories to make them more compelling that we would never even consider doing. You could falsify facts, you could make things up, you could invent details, the story might be more, engaging if it took place in the Caribbean than if it took place in, Northern California. But you don't do that, I mean, we obviously don't do many things that might make them more readable. The use of pseudonyms is not comparable to introducing those kinds of facts, but I do think it's a sort of dodgy practice. All right, let me go to the next example, and you've already sort of anticipated it, but let's imagine you're writing about drug use on the campus, whatever campus we're talking about here. And so, you go around and you do certain reporting, and you see kids smoking marijuana. They're at a public place. You find out their names. You could name them. There's no legal prohibition from doing this. So the first question would be, do you name kids who, let's say you didn't even talk to them. You just saw them and you knew who they were. You could, don't, hold that thought for a minute, because I want your thoughts on whether you should or could name them. Then you continue to do your reporting, and you have a teenager who comes to you and says that he or she has gone through drug treatment, that they had a meth addiction, they've gone through the treatment successfully. The student says, he's clean now. The treatment program gave him, a new lease on life. He really feels back in control of himself. And he wants to talk about the program and use himself as a model for other students, because he knows, and he can tell you that there are other students who are smoking meth. So he wants to be named. You go to his parents and they say, we want him to be named too, because this is this triumphant moment in his life. He has come back from the abyss. And we really think, we know that a bunch of his friends are in the same problem, and we think that him coming forward like this in the newspaper will not only help him, but help them. All right, so the two questions are, do you feel comfortable naming kids who you haven't talked to, who are doing something relatively minor, and they're smoking marijuana as opposed to a more serious drug? And the second question, do you name this kid who's come to you and wants to talk about his methamphetamine and his recovery from it? Who wants to go first? Yes.
I don't know, I think personally, I definitely wouldn't name the kids that I just saw. Because if I didn't go talk to them, they would have no idea that I am. Then I'd be like me walking down the street and then someone like, you reading the newspaper like, oh, Chris was walking down the street. And I'd be like, what?
It would be a startling moment when they picked up the paper, yes.
There's no reason to really name them, so I probably wouldn't name them. And if the kid really did want to be named and he was trying to use himself as kind of an inspiration for other people, then, and his parents were okay with it, definitely I don't see any, I don't know if I'm missing something, but.
No, you're not missing anything. I guess the only reason I would cause anyone to pause over that conclusion, and I'm not disagreeing with it, is the implications of admitting serious drug use as a kid will not go away tomorrow, whether it's relevant to colleges or employers. And I say this partly out of a little experience that I had, and not to make too much of it, but there is a student newspaper, high school student newspaper in the Los Angeles area, where one of the students had an experience like this and came and wanted to write an op-ed piece for us about that experience. And we had a really serious conversation, and for a variety of reasons it didn't happen, but so the example doesn't really have an ending. But it prompted just this conversation of what happens when someone wants to talk about something that is really important and sort of redemptive in their own lives, but that may have consequences that are hard for them to fully appreciate. Now, in this case, the parents are helpful in that, but that's the only reason to raise it, though. Yes?
I think in the case of the student who wants to be named, with the addiction, I don't think that I would print his name.
Is that right?
Even though he said that he would be fine with it, because if he and his parents are trying to get to his friends, he has the ability to tell his friends, read this article about me. And also, too, he can take other private measures, like eventually trying to write a book or something like that, that can thrust himself into the limelight under his own responsibility. And then the paper doesn't really have that burden, I guess, of the negative ramifications for like job interviews and things like that.
Certainly, just using his first name or blurring out his identity some would erase all of those implications. It would make the story presumably also somewhat less compelling, because the part of the strength of the story, I think, would be that this is someone who's been through something that has been so fundamentally changed his life in his own view that he's willing now to talk about something deeply personal in a very open way. And so the story would be missing that piece of compelling information. Yes.
I kind of feel like that information might come out anyways, like on a lot of college applications and job interviews, you have to kind of reveal that information anyway, so I have less of an issue revealing his name, but I kind of want to see like if he's taken steps to maybe do like group speeches or going to things where he's
How public is he, in other words? Right. Now, and you're right that some information, whether he'd been arrested, for instance, probably, or convicted, would undoubtedly be part of his sort of formal record. But let's assume for a moment that this is a kid who had this problem and then sought out treatment on his own. So there isn't a record that would show up on a college application or a job application. If you have suffered from addiction and fixed it yourself, that's really not part of what you would consider sort of your permanent record. Yes?
I was going to say, chances are, like I said, willing to go out and write that the ramifications of like the drug addiction are probably much more severe than ever worrying about like a job interview or, you know, college application that they've already, you know, kind of waded into. This is something that's, you know, more extreme than anything else that might come up. So.
And one thing you could do is you could remind them of that. You could say both to the kid and the parents, hey, listen, I just want to be clear that when we put this in the paper and it goes online, that, you know, that this is not going to go away in a week. This is going to be around forever, so let's make a big decision here, not a little one. Yes?
I feel like this kid is very open with this, and he's gonna, whether it's in your paper or like, I don't know, I'm thinking, I could see this kid like even writing it in a college application, like as a story, so it's like, if he'll reveal it outwardly, like he's gonna reveal other places, so I feel like revealing his name is, you know, either gonna happen now or later.
So beat everyone else to the punch then, right? Yes?
I was thinking kind of along the same lines as her. I mean, not necessarily in every situation, but I know for a lot of college apps, they ask you something you've struggled with and like overcome, and that's an amazing story. To hear that is very inspiring. So.
Well, I think that would be the gist of the story, presumably, too.
Yeah, and I feel like people, although it does reflect like he's had bad history, it also reflects that he's like a strong person, and you know, so it has both positives and negatives. So I feel like they kind of weigh each other out a little bit.
One thing too that you should think about in these is sometimes people, kids or otherwise, will consent to their names being used because they have a story in their head that they think is what the story is going to look like. And that is undoubtedly the story that this kid would be thinking, is that they'll write a story about my heroism in dealing with this. Heroism is not a good word of drug, but, you know, I mean, my, you know, the strength of character that it took me to overcome all this. One problem is as you go to write it, the writer may not be as persuaded that this is a story about great redemption. The writer may think of this as sort of just a tawdry story about drug addiction, and the story may come out much differently than the way the parents or the kid imagine, at which point then you're left with a whole different kind of concern, which is that then they're going to be angry that they thought they were consenting to the isn't my kid great story, and what came out is wasn't my kid sort of a yucky drug addict. So, you know, one thing to be careful in all of these is not raising false expectations or not overpromising a source, or in this case the source's parents, what they might expect from the ultimate piece. Because you may not know when you're having that conversation about disclosing, you may not know what that story is going to look like in the end. Yeah.
We've talked about how colleges probably wouldn't necessarily judge this kid and that would make a great essay, which I think is true. But once you're done with college, it's going to be totally different when you're trying to get a job. And no employer is going to look on that favorably, I don't think. So yeah, I would make it clear to the kid, like, look, this is really going to affect you, and unless you want a career in like public speaking about this, or that's like your thing.
Which is a hard thing to know when you're 17, probably, right?
Exactly. So I mean, if the kid really wanted me to, I would do it, but I personally, if I were the kid, would not want that.
Right.
Regarding the kids just smoking weed and whether you put their names, I think that's the same as the sex example that we used, where that's something that we just know is going on. Like, kids in high school are going to be smoking weed, kids in high school are going to be having sex. So to give a name really doesn't enhance anything. It just sort of implicates these kids. It's not like there's a government official who has this big leak on this scandal where, like, then, let's use that anonymous.
I would say the only, there are minor differences, but only minor ones, I would say, between the sex example and the smoking weed example, which is that first, the smoking weed example, presumably you could see it yourself. So you wouldn't have to ask someone to confess it to you. I mean, you might or might not see it yourself, but assuming that they're doing it in a relatively public place, you could see it. So the issues of self-identification are different. The other thing is, frankly, even though it is not a law that we, you know, care a whole lot about, it is illegal as opposed to two 18-year-olds having sex, which wouldn't be illegal. Yes.
At the beginning of all this, you said that as a journalist, it's not about the legality, it's about the ethical issue. And
Correct, for the most part.
You understand the consequences of putting names in the paper. And if you know that you said it's your job to then protect them, so right away, then I wouldn't want to put the names in there when I was using minors, because you understand the consequences, even if they don't, and whether they give you permission or not, they might be doing it without.
And I think that is that is that is ultimately the thing that makes reporting about children tough, because you do have a responsibility to them that goes beyond, in some ways, their responsibility to themselves. That said, I think there are instances where a good, thoughtful, ethical judgment would cause one to name the kid. And this example might be one. As I say, these are not really objectively determinable, but if this kid, with the parents' consent and whatnot, wants to confess to something for a specific set of reasons and has done so thoughtfully, then it's important to listen to them. Now, I think your point was an interesting one, which is that you wouldn't do it yourself, but you might think that it was okay for this kid to do it. That's also a fair judgment, although that ought to cause you to think hard on it. If it's something that you wouldn't do in your own life and you're gonna sort of facilitate someone else doing it, that's a warning sign that you're close to the line anyway. Yes?
I think in this case, like, although you would be close to line, I think that you could go with the kid, like, and I agree with him that you could let the kid talk, because, like, especially with, like, drugs or something that's so, like, shameful, and, like, for him, it's probably a huge part of his recovery process to come out.
Right.
And be, like, so this could be, like, way better for him than, like, maybe some job person might have read this article 20 years ago or something, but, I mean, realistically, probably not.
Well, but let's say this kid grows up and wants to be a cop. You know, it's going to get a lot harder because of this story. Now, you know, and you know, Goldman Sachs may read this different than the University of California. You know, I mean, so it may be that what, in some eyes, as you were saying, an employer may regard this far differently than as a story of redemption. An employer may regard this as someone that, you know, given two kids, one who's been a drug addict and one who hasn't, I think I'll go with the one who hasn't. And so it may have ramifications that are invisible or hard to perceive from the vantage point of a 17-year-old who has just overcome this, who believes that this is the foundational moment in his life, but who may look back on it 10 years from now and think, God, wasn't I an idiot to talk about this? You know, that's the problem. Is your
30-year-old that wants to, you know, it would still have the same ramifications for him.
Good point.
As it would for the 17-year-old, and just because he's 30 and making a poor decision doesn't necessarily mean that it's more responsible.
all true, although I would say that as a journalist, I feel less responsible for the well-being of a 30-year-old than I do for a 17-year-old. In that I recognize that there's plenty of 30-year-olds, you know, I've met plenty of them, who can't make a good decision either. But at some point, you know, you're kind of on your own. And I think a reporter has or a journalist has a special responsibility to think about the implications. Not always to decide them in favor of withholding a name, but at least to think through and talk through the implications when it comes to children. Yes?
I think it's really difficult that it's the responsibility of the journalist, because journalists have, you know, everyone has completely different ethical beliefs. And so to me, it seems simple that when the child gives consent and the parents give consent, and you're informing them of their ramifications, then I think it's like, it seems to me, even though I've never been put in that position, that it's simple that you publish the names. But then for journalists who think that they shouldn't, they don't publish names, where do you draw the line? That means most of their articles are going to be anonymous sources, because if that simple one where they do give consent and they do want their names published, that seems unethical, then most of their other sources would appear to be so as well. And so it kind of would make all their articles less.
And as with many things that we've already talked about and we'll still talk about in this class, that's why it's very hard to speak in absolutes, I think, on this. And that there are some 14 or 15-year-olds who are, you know, with their parents' knowledge and consent and discussion, feel like they are making a more thoughtful, considered decision than some 16 or 17-year-olds who seem acting recklessly, and that who aren't listening when you warn them of the ramifications. So some of this is very much kind of touch and feel, dealing with both the seriousness of what you're going to write about. You know, as we talked about here, I think it'd be one thing to talk about, you know, sort of something that would get you in trouble at school, another something that would get you arrested. Some things are mildly uncomfortable to talk about, and some things are severely uncomfortable to talk about. And so there is a lot of responsibility on a journalist in these instances to make really fine judgments that are hard to, there's no absolute rule for most of them. Yeah.
I agree with that. It almost seems like the journalist doesn't have the right to take that decision away from the parents and the student when they're both so, you know, set on making this decision.
Right.
I don't
You would have, yeah, well, and that can go either direction. I mean, you know, right, you're saying if they all said, we really would want to disclose this, and you said no, but then there's the other situation where they all say, well, we really don't want to disclose it, and you want to say yes. So then, you know, that can cut either direction. In general, it is a high burden, I would say, to overcome the desires of the source and the parents. The only instance where I've put out, even for discussion, of people of disclosing an identity without that kind of consent is the example of the kids smoking in public. And there, only because they're doing something in public would you even consider doing that, I think. Yes.
To go back to that example of them smoking in public and not talking to them just because they're in public and you say their name or whatever, I still think that I would refrain from putting their names in the paper because, and especially if that is a service to yourself and not talking. What if one of them has a medical card? What if it's
Good point. Really good point. Yeah. What you see may not be the whole story. It's tempting to think it is. I mean, you know, this comes up with photography all the time. You know, I mean, you go down to Skid Row right now, you could take a picture of people doing drugs. And even if you didn't name them, if you pictured them, now again, as a legal matter, if you're going to smoke crack on a street corner, there's always the possibility that you're going to show up in the newspaper. You know, and so if you don't want to show up in the newspaper, then you probably shouldn't smoke crack on a street corner. But if you're dealing with kids, if you're dealing with different kinds of, you know, then it may not be that just because you have the legal right to do something that you should do it. And you're right. I mean, there is no, as far as I know, there is no card that would permit you to smoke crack on a street corner. But with marijuana, it's even a little different because there might actually even be legal. Yes.
Just talking about the high school students who you witnessed with doing drugs. Isn't there a chance? I mean, we've talked about this before, where you can get, if you say up front you're not going to name them and you'll keep them anonymous, you're actually going to get a more colorful, more detailed story
Maybe.
out of it.
Mm-hmm.
So wasn't there sort of like a decision there?
Well, that really goes to the sort of anonymous sourcing conversation we had the other day, which is that yes, there's some information that people will not tell you if they're going to be named, and sometimes the benefit of that information outweighs the benefit of naming them, and that's a calculus that has to be done in the context of considering anonymous sources. And that calculus, I think, it just gets tweaked if they're kids, because the naming, you know, you want to be more reluctant to name with kids than you would be with adults, because you're assuming that their decision to go on the record is not as informed as it would be for an adult. You know, but anytime you withhold that piece of information, you also take a piece of information out of the story that is, you know, potentially relevant to it. We could talk about this a long time, but let me move on. There's just two other instances related with kids that I would just sort of factor in here, which have to do with self-identification. A lot of kids, obviously, this is no secret to any of you, but we'll put things on a Facebook page or in a blog, or we'll confess to things that may be the same things you're asking them. So let's say you're talking to a student who says, you know, I don't want to be on the record, but I smoke weed before class every day. And then that same kid puts on his on his Facebook page that he smokes weed every day. There are ways in which kids do stupid things, so do grown-ups, but there are additional complexities introduced to this when kids are admitting to things in a different context. And again, there's no firm answer. Just because someone has put something on a Facebook page doesn't mean you can put it in the newspaper. You don't know that it's true in many instances. So, and this goes to your point earlier about identifying someone else. If someone puts on his Facebook page, Bob and I smoke pot every day before we go to class. Well, Bob may not appreciate that, and it may not be true. So the mere fact that it shows up somewhere doesn't necessarily mean that the gloves are off and you can write about it. You need to verify. Even before you reach the question of whether you identify, you need to know whether it's true. And that same issue arises in a slightly different context, but which is children who avail themselves of the legal system, kids who sue. If you are reporting on a lawsuit and you accurately reflect what's in the lawsuit, you are protected legally from being held from libel or other action that might come against you. But people put stuff in lawsuits that are not true. This comes up in divorce proceedings all the time. I mean, the allegations that people will make in a divorce are limitless, and you are utterly protected in writing about them legally, but ethically, you have the same responsibilities to check and verify. And that is especially true with kids. I mean, there will, the other thing that is very hard to discern in a lawsuit that a kid brings against another party. Is it the kid who's really talking in the lawsuit, or is it the parents using the kid to make some other point? So, you know, these other documents or these other records that might seem to answer your questions may not. They may include falsehoods. That you may be protected in writing about them in the case of lawsuits, although not in the case of writing about someone's Facebook page or whatever. But just because someone has said something in one of these things doesn't mean that you can then just pile it into the newspaper. Okay, so let's move from children to the other category that I wanted to talk about today, which is crime victims. And now we're talking about adults, which is the sort of key difference from the last section here. All right, so let me talk a little bit about the case that I hope you've all read on the Geneva Overholzer coverage in the Des Moines Register. First, let me ask you a question here, without revealing any details. Has anyone here ever been the victim of a violent crime? Well, that's good. The question I would ask you to ask yourselves hypothetically then is, had you been a victim of any kind of violent crime, would reading about it in the newspaper make it worse? And assuming that you were named. That, you know, would the exposure of that event, and presumably exposure that's going to last, I mean, a newspaper comes out every day, but as we've talked about, these archives go on forever. You know, for many people, the experience of a crime is awful, obviously, but the experience is handled by putting it into one's past. And that the existence of a record of it, a public record of it, can make it more painful. There's a survey cited in the text that says that, and I didn't look up the survey itself, but assume it to be true, that some 2/3 of women surveyed said that they would be less likely to report it if they'd been raped if they thought that that would be publicly reported. Now, if that's true, that's a powerful argument against naming a victim, because it means that people might be less likely to come forward, or that it might extend and perpetuate their suffering. Anyway, so with that as a backdrop, let me just say, you know, in 1991, Geneva Overholzer, who actually is here in LA now, wrote a really important column about the stigma of rape, and the way that she argued, the way that reporting about rape contributed to the stigma. That it suggested that there was something wrong or culpable about victims, because we don't generally withhold the names of people who are victims of assaults, or certainly people who are victims of murder. And one of her arguments is that by having a different standard with respect to rape, that we suggest that rape is somehow different, and that there's something wrong with the victim. She wrote, she said, as long as rape is deemed unspeakable and therefore not fully or honestly spoken of, the public outrage will be muted as well. So she argued that there was really a social consequence too, not just a victim consequence, but a social consequence to this refusal to identify rape victims. There's a young woman who read her column. I think she was in a library, in fact, when she read it. Her name is Nancy Ziegenmeyer. She read the column, and she had been raped. And she decided, she was quite persuaded by the piece. She lived in Iowa. She called, Geneva at the time was the editor of the Des Moines Register. She called Overholzer and agreed to be the subject of a piece that would talk at great length about her experience and would name her. It was quite a piece, and I didn't put it, it wasn't in that pointer set of packages, but if you're interested, I can get you a copy of the piece. It is a series. It described the rape in great detail, and really, in some ways, shocking detail. It talked about her dealings with the criminal justice system, with the hospitals, with this whole aftermath of the rape, the effect on her marriage. It was deeply personal. It also, I should say, as an aside, there was another, and that attracted a huge amount of response from readers, pro and con, although mostly pro. There was another side note to this issue, which is that she's a white woman. She was raped by a black man. So it introduced a racial component into the conversation. That, too, was the subject of much discussion. Overholzer tried to address that particular issue by writing a separate column about pointing out how rare, in fact, interracial rape is. But this was, you can imagine, in Iowa in particular, this was a quite startling piece of work. Let me quote Overholzer one more time on the question of naming rape victims. She says, when journalists depart from the commitment to telling the whole story, to naming names, to getting at painful truths, we tread on dangerous ground. With very few exceptions, national security, individual cases in which loss of a job or loss of life clearly will ensue, the best journalistic principle is to tell the public what we know. Selecting certain categories of information and seeking to do social work by acting against this principle is dangerous territory. I think that's an almost indisputable statement. It doesn't, however, solve the question of whether we should do this or not. It just points out that when we do it at cost. And the examples that she gives are essentially the same categories that we've talked about in here, national security or places where someone's job or life might be threatened. The series was awarded the 1991 Pulitzer for Public Service, the highest award in journalism. And it prompted an ongoing conversation that continues today in news organizations about how to deal with crime victims generally, but specifically whether to segregate off rape as a separate category to be reported on differently than other crimes. And so I want to hear your views on that. Before I do, let me just point out a couple things here. First, as I indicated at the outset, we're talking about adult victims here now. So we're not talking about the issues with kids with respect to whether they can make sort of cogent decisions about identification. Some victims of rape or any other crime will readily agree to be identified for some of the same reasons that Nancy Ziegenmeier did. Or because they don't believe that there's anything wrong with them. They're talking about something that happened to them, not something that they participated in. But there are real questions that arise with respect to those victims who don't want to be identified, either because you can't reach them. Oftentimes you're looking at a police report or some other kind of document that will identify a victim, but you don't know how to get in touch with the victim. Or you reach a victim and they say, you know what, I understand your job, but I do not want to be in your newspaper. So what do? Go ahead. Sure.
You don't name them because rape, like I work with rape victims, and you have to segregate it because rape is a crime there could be a stigma with it because that oftentimes, like when you look at like less than 10% of rapes happen from someone like the stranger. It's usually someone they know. And one thing you have to keep in mind is what society looks at with the rape victim is what did they do to deserve to get raped. Whereas like if you got carjacked, it's like, oh well, it's your fault. You were driving a Mercedes. Oh, you shouldn't have been driving there. With the rape victim, it's like, oh well, she was drunk. Of course she got raped, or she was wearing this. So it's a completely different.
Is
crime.
That stigma made worse by the refusal to identify the victim?
Maybe, but I don't think so.
I don't want to take it off the issue of rape, so treat this as a short diversion. I have someone very close to me who's gay, who was the victim of a hate crime based on his homosexuality. Should that be treated differently? Is there more or less stigma attached to that kind of crime than a rape?
Probably not.
Yeah, same basic calculus, I would think. And yet I suspect newspapers, for the most part, don't have a practice of not naming victims of hate crimes, or particularly at least that kind of hate crime.
It's interesting. I think it takes it into new territory whenever you're dealing with sex or sexuality. I feel like
There's an intimacy that's an issue,
it's a
for
bigger
sure.
issue than if you were just held at gunpoint, or because I don't think there's any shame associated with being held at gunpoint. But for some people, there's a shame associated with being gay, or a great stigma with being gay, or with being the victim of rape.
Yes.
I agree with that because one of my best friends has actually been raped, and it took her like 6 months to tell me.
Right. So even to tell someone close to her, right? And presumably reading her name in a paper would have added to that pain. Yes.
I think it kind of depends on what we were talking about earlier, whether that person chose to be, part of the story, or whether they chose to say, this is what I'm going to do. Because I do believe that the more people do come out with that kind of information with hate crimes and with the rape situation, it does tend to destigmatize it, and also can be used as a sense of empowerment, in that area. But you also can't do that to somebody if they're not ready, you know what I mean? Like, if you found out about the story a year later, 5 years later, it's still just as legitimate of a story, and now that person is past a point in their life, if they're ready, they've passed a point in their life where they can overcome it, and they can see a sense of empowerment, and are able to help everybody, help other people in that same situation. Now, if it's the day after, and you're telling them, tell me, because I want you to be in my story, obviously that's not
a good idea. You know what I mean? It definitely depends on the situation, who the person is, how they're identifying, how they're presenting themselves as a victim of this crime.
I guess I certainly agree. I guess the question would be, all of that assumes that there is something intrinsically different about rape from any other violent crime. And one question, one sort of larger social question here is, does treating rape as a different crime seem to suggest that there is something wrong with the victims of that crime, that they are somehow culpable in a way that we would never suggest that the victim of a carjacking, to use James's example, was culpable for that. We wouldn't think to question that person's motives or whether that person was drinking or how that person was dressing. And I guess the question I would pose is, by treating rape differently, do we perpetuate that notion that somehow the victim's conduct is relevant to the reporting of the crime?
I personally think that it depends. I think in the very beginning, since we are in a situation where it is a stigma, you are going to have to take that time.
Mm-hmm.
But as it grows, as it develops, if it were to able to be less stigmatized in the first place, then maybe we wouldn't have to face that, and you could start treating it as a normal crime. But at the point that we are right now socially, there is a stigma. You can't erase that.
Not ready
You
for that.
can't erase it tomorrow. You know, it is going to be something that's an evolution of the way people think socially.
Please.
Just going with what you were saying about stigma, if you look at how HIV and AIDS was represented in like the 80s and the early 90s, and how people basically thought it was a gay disease, you could get it from kissing, like all these like misinformation that people were getting. Now we're at the point that a lot of people are educated about HIV and AIDS, and I think that if rape victims are able to tell their stories and tell what they went through, like yes, it would contribute to the destigmatization in the future, but not necessarily.
Yeah, and I would also say that with respect to some of that sort of demystification of AIDS, some of that is the result of very candid, very bracing reporting that at the time was very controversial. A lot of the reporting the San Francisco Chronicle did on AIDS in the early years was considered quite out there, and as was this piece in the Des Moines Register, both because of where it appeared and when it appeared. Was there someone over here? Yes.
One of the authors that we read said something about rape being analogous to a type of torture, and that it was a torture that, I don't know like what newspapers' policies are on, reporting different types of serial killer-esque torture, but this is something that I think is really intimate for women, especially if they're married or they have various religious beliefs, and so I think there's a certain caution there. But there are women, I think that the problem with the stigma of rape is that there's a sort of poor decision-making that's assigned to rape victims, but like someone mentioned, like acquaintance rape and whatever, but there are really strong women who didn't make any poor decisions, and they just had some male friend or male stranger who took advantage of them, and I think that if that woman wants to be named, then she should be, and I think that would be important for
There was a case, it's alluded to in the text, and I was involved in editing these pieces. This is back in, I think it was 2003, 2004, of a couple of teenage girls who were abducted in Southern California and driven sort of across Southern California. And there was a big search for them, and the police released their names in an attempt to help find them, and then disclosed that they'd been raped. And there was a really difficult set of decisions for a lot of news organizations about whether, at that point, because the radio and TV folks had already broadcast their names, so how do you sort of take the name back out of the public record? This morning I was trying to remember how we handled that, and I don't remember precisely. I think that what happened at the paper is, because this is before we were sort of publishing as actively on the web as we were, that it all happened kind of in the course of one news cycle, and we didn't end up using their names, partly because they were victims of rape and we hadn't gotten their agreement to use their names, but also partly because they were minors. But it does, there's no instance, there's no possible way that one could infer any bad decision-making on their part. They were kidnapped, taken away. So it was the worst case scenario in some ways of a stranger rape, but also one in which no reader, no decent, fair-minded reader could in any way infer that they had made a bad decision or had somehow contributed to this event. Yes?
I don't know the exact statistics. I know a lot more women than men are raped, but I think when a couple of the stories just use she or her when referring to rape victims, and I think that perpetuates the stigma, because it's easy to look at a woman that was raped and say oh, she was wearing this, she was asking for it. But I think if it was a man in the same case, we wouldn't say oh, he was dressing provocatively or something like that. And one of the stories.
It's an appealing idea, but it's right.
One of the stories had a picture of a man who was raped, and I think show that it's not just like the women who are like the victims, it's, you know, like anyone. So I think it's important to show both sides and not just say.
Right. You know, one interesting thing that I did not know until I was researching it for this class, but the apparently the reader reaction to the Register was overwhelmingly favorable toward the series. And of course, it's assisted by the fact that this woman was so cooperative throughout. So there's some of the issues are not reached about identifying someone without their permission. But that that men were far less appreciative of the series than women. That men registered many more concerns about the graphic nature of the series. And so it's interesting that there is that kind of cleavage in it. And I had not realized that until I read as I said, I was reading to get ready for this. Yeah.
Honestly, I don't feel like any crime victim should be reported if they don't want to be, because they've been through enough trauma as it is, whether it's gunpoint or rape or whatever it is. And I feel like if they don't want to be, if they're dealing with these emotions and like trauma from it, that why would you want to increase that as a reporter? I mean, you're ethically, as a human being, that sounds like wrong, you know. So just because it's your job doesn't mean that you should.
If you know, if George Clooney is you know, held up at gunpoint in Brentwood tonight, you don't put that in the paper?
Well, I mean,
not that I wish that on Lord George Clooney.
I mean, that's tough because he is a public figure, but especially for private individuals that otherwise would not ever be in the...
Where their only thing they're known for is being a victim of a crime.
And I do think also there's something intrinsically different in our society about rape, which makes it even more of a crime where you need to treat it very sensitively and make sure that you're not increasing someone's trauma towards the incident.
Oh, yes, in the back.
Yeah, I definitely agree. I think there's something different about our society in general, just with sexuality. I'm curious, do you know anything about, like, in Europe, if they report?
Oh, good question. I don't know the answer to that.
Because I know that sexuality is much more spoken openly.
Mm-hmm.
And there's just a lot of stigma attached to sexuality in general in the United States, so I think that's definitely a factor.
I mean, one of the real bottom line questions of this is whether rape is properly thought of in a sexual context at all. But you're right, certainly that there's a physicality to it that is undeniable. And I don't know if European papers treat it differently. That's a good question. Yes?
I think there's also the problem when you don't name the so-called victim of falsely accusing someone and defaming. Okay, that's a really strong word.
No, it's a good.
Technically, like when reading, naming someone and finding out later that that person, you know, was not responsible, and you tarnish their reputation without being fair and ethical in your reporting by not naming the accuser.
In fact, I'm about to deal with a case that deals with that quite directly, but I know you had a question, or you had a thought too.
I was just going to say that we live in a very extremely sexually repressed society, back to what she was saying, and there's a big double standard between men and women in terms of sex, and when it comes to a woman being raped, and the first thing people are going to say is, oh, she's asking for it, and stuff like that. Another thing is a lot of women don't come forward because in our society now, when a woman accuses a man of rape and takes him to court over it, it'll more turn into her sexuality and her sexual history will be on trial more than the actual act of rape itself. So when it comes down to it, it's kind of like, to me, it's like a chicken and the egg kind of thing. Is a stigma about rape because, you know, we're not publishing the names and we're not doing that, or, you know, was the stigma already there and we're just feeding it?
Right, and I think that's an impossible question to answer. I guess the question is sort of, given where we are now, should we change the standard of reporting in the hopes that that would move the stigma, or is it too soon to change it because the stigma is so strong that to change it would cause further harm to people? And again, there's no perfect answer to that. I do want to move on to the next example here. I appreciate that, but let me do this quickly because we're running out of time. And it goes to exactly your point of sort of the question of the accused in these. And for this, let me talk about a case that I'm sure many of you know about, which is the Michael Jackson. There's two Michael Jackson cases, and I'm going to talk about the first one, which I know more about because I was involved in the coverage of it. This is back in '93. Jackson was accused of molesting a 13-year-old boy. You know, there's an endless set of stories and descriptions about all of this, but the boy, under the urging of his father and mother were apart, and there's a lot of cross currents throughout all of this. But in any case, the boy described what he said was sexual contact between himself and Jackson. He included descriptions of when and where that was said to have occurred. He also included a description of Jackson's genitalia. Jackson admitted during the course of all of this sort of hoopla, he admitted that he had shared his bed with young boys. It's a big bed, as he said. He admitted showering in their presence, but he steadfastly denied that he had ever molested this kid or anyone. The police did an investigation. It was both up in Ventura and down here because some of this was alleged to have occurred at Neverland, his house. The father of the boy wanted payment to his son for his injuries. It was a terribly humiliating experience, as you would expect for Jackson. He was an internationally renowned celebrity. When he returned to the United States after being out of the country for a while in December, he was strip searched in order to compare his genitalia to the boy's description. He issued a statement at the time, which I'll read to you. He said, "I ask all of you to wait and hear the truth before you label or condemn me. Don't treat me like a criminal because I am innocent. I have been forced to submit to a dehumanizing and humiliating examination. It was the most humiliating ordeal of my life. But if this is what I have to endure to prove my innocence, my complete innocence, so be it." Again, to cut to the end, because we are almost out of time here, but eventually Jackson paid this boy some $20 million to settle this case. The boy then left the area and was unavailable to testify in the criminal prosecution of Jackson, which then collapsed. Throughout all of this, Jackson alleged that he was not, in fact, a child molester, but he was the victim of an extortion attempt, and that the boy's father was trying to extort money out of him. So here's the sort of question that arises in the journalistically, which is that because of our reluctance to name either the victims of sexual abuse or children who are the victims of crime, this boy's identity, which now is quite public, by the way, but in the day was known to me, it was known to editors of the LA Times, it was known to many people covering this case, but it was not reported. Jackson's identity, of course, was reported endlessly. Now, the boy alleges that he's a victim of a crime, and Jackson alleges that he's the victim of a crime. But one crime victim is a matter of public record, and the other isn't. And so I guess the question is, do our sort of predilections with respect to protecting the identities of children or crime victims create a kind of unfairness in an instance like this, in that one side is held publicly accountable in a way that the other side isn't? Thoughts? Yes?
I don't know if I'd use this case as an example because Michael Jackson was already a public figure.
The most public figure, right?
Aside from that, in like a regular case, if that were the question, the victim didn't ask to be the victim. So I think, there's the distinction right there, the other
Well,
person.
presumably, though, Jackson did not ask to be the victim of an extortion attempt, right? I mean,
True, 'cause he's-
there are different kinds of crimes,
In
but
this case, he's also claiming that he's a victim of something else. In like another case where it's just a child that is claiming that someone molested them or whatever, and where like the newspaper will run the name of the accused but not the child's name. It is unfair in that, but it's not. It's kind of more like the court of public opinion as opposed to a real court. In a real court, they have the right to face their accuser, but in the court of public opinion, I guess it's different. You don't.
yeah, it is different. There's no doubt about it. Yes.
The problem I have with just immediately naming the accuser is that a lot of rapes go unreported on whatever because people are afraid to name their accuser, since a lot of them are they already have a relationship with that person, friend, family, whatever. And so I think that if you're going to start reporting the names of accusers just right away, it's going to have a decrease in morally.
Yeah, and we are talking about a 13-year-old boy here, too. We're not talking about someone who is accusing Jackson of a hit and run out on the highway. I mean, this is someone who is presumably quite vulnerable and for whom there would be considerable stigma that might attach to him for the rest of his life. Yes.
I think because Michael was such a huge public figure, it was sort of unfair from the beginning because just the simple fact that he's that big, everyone just sort of felt like he should have known better, whether he did or didn't do it.
He's also, let's face it, a little bit odd, I mean, and so I mean, regardless of whether he did this, I think that fueled the sense that there might be something to this,
Right, and because it was odd, for many people, I think everyone just sort of felt like you should have known how other people were going to take it, regardless of that it was odd or not.
Right. Uh-huh. Yes.
The problem I have with this is, even though Jackson's a public figure, and I'm not really sure how to rectify the situation, but the problem that I have with it is that, you know, people say, you know, the boy didn't ask to be a victim. What if he did? Like, what if it is an extortion deal? What if he did ask to be the victim? You know, like, what if this is, you know, just a money thing? Like,
It's certainly plausible that nothing happened to the boy and that the dad saw an opportunity here to make a lot of money, and in fact did. You know, now that I'm not trying to suggest that this didn't happen to the boy, but it's certainly in reporting on it, you have to keep that idea firmly in mind. That's certainly possible. Who else? Yes.
Kind of relating to her point, he acted, in my opinion, and I feel like a lot of people's opinion, inappropriately, regardless of whether or not he sexually molested the kid, because, I mean, you shouldn't be letting them sleep in your bed, and you shouldn't be showering in their presence.
It's certainly not typical. Yeah.
That's not a good idea. Like, and I feel like.
Well, I think it's very, very much on your point that yes, if he, you know, he led a different life than most of us lead, and that some people, I think, who didn't think that he did this, nevertheless thought that he was reckless in allowing himself to be subject to this kind of charge. Yes.
So showering in their presence and like all the activities that went down, was that just solely based on what the boy was saying, or was?
No, I think Jackson admitted a lot of that. I mean, there's some of this, and it's been a long time, obviously, but you know, Jackson admitted that he had slept in the bed with other kids. He admitted that he'd showered in their presence. I mean, his point was they are special friends, but there is not sexual contact between them. So that's the line he was trying to draw. Now, that's not the line that typically gets drawn in a case like this. So that's why it was in a kind of, you know, it was in an area that people were unfamiliar with at a minimum. Yes?
The whole naming question in this case is hard because I definitely think there is a different standard for public figures, kind of like how there was a different standard for public figures with defamation. I just think like the news in general, it's pretty hard not to report when a public figure, something comes up about them. So.
Certainly, pretty much everyone found it pretty hard not to report this. Good, well listen, we are just about out of time. Let me just say as an epilogue, a sad epilogue to this case, of course you all know that Jackson died a few months ago. The boy's father then committed suicide soon thereafter. The father of the boy committed suicide. You be the judge. Let me say, okay, for next week, you'll notice, I sent the note around yesterday, I hope everyone got it, on the readings for next week. You will notice that they overlap a little bit with the readings for this week, just because topically they overlap a little. Don't worry about it, you will have already read it. And then on Tuesday, we'll talk a little bit about the midterm. I'm out of town this weekend, so it'll be a little hard for me to get email, but I'm back on Sunday night, so if you have anything to get to me, I'll get it then. So have a nice weekend. Thank you.